right? There's just too many police officers and we should reduce the police force. If we think about it, these are really the types of questions that motivated the original contributions to the economics of crime, going back to Beccaria, Bentham, Becker, Stigler, and Early, right? So a lot of the motivation to their initial work was related to questions such as this. So why are we actually coming back to this, right? Basically for two reasons. One is that this theoretical literature is mostly very stylized, so relatively little has been done after the original contribution. I'm not saying that nothing has been done, but relatively little. And the literature remains very, very stylized. By that meaning that the discussions are typically conceptual or qualitative, and they explore theoretically the potential trade-offs, right? I mean, just in terms of the general idea of the trade-offs, right? And the empirical literature is dominated by reduced form studies that typically are going to be analyzing the effectiveness of marginal changes in affecting the crime rate, right? So what happens if we increase a little bit the size of the police? What happens if we increase punishment a little bit? So we still, after 50 years, I think 50 years of economics of crime was celebrated recently in 2018. After these 50 years, we still do not share kind of a common canonical framework to analyze interactions across policies, right? So by that, I mean, so for instance, if we increase the harshness of punishments, if we increase sentence lengths, does it actually affect the optimal size of the police force and the optimal location of police? How actually equilibrium responses are going to interact with the optimality of different policies, right? So if I increase the size of the police force, this is going to actually affect the behavior of individuals, the behavior of criminals, and this actually is going to resonate in other dimensions, including sentencing, for instance, right? So this is part of a project that we've been developing for some time, and the goal of this broader project is to develop a structural model that's going to allow us to study the optimality of public security policies, right? So this theory is going to incorporate the trade-offs across different dimensions of policy, and also are going to incorporate equilibrium responses of crime, right? So changes in behavior of potential criminals due to changes in policy. And this, because we are actually combining these different dimensions, we're going to be able to conduct some types of analysis that would not be possible with current theoretical models, and also would not be possible with reduced form empirical papers, right? I mean, with the evidence from reduced form empirical studies. And we illustrate briefly the potential use of this type of framework by conducting a quantitative exercise using US data. So this exercise focuses on property crimes and looks at 2004 moments of the US, and also relies a lot on well-identified estimates from the empirical literature to estimate some of the parameters of the model. And from a broader perspective, I think one of the contributions of this broader project is to bridge a little bit the gap between empirical and theoretical work on economics of crime, because these are two large literatures, but actually there's very little, nowadays there's very little dialogue between them. So I'm going to present you in the next 4 slides, I think, the main ingredients and really the objective of this paper. And hopefully I'm going to have time to go over the main points in more detail later on, but if not, at least the message is clear here with these first 4 slides. So in our model, a public security policy is going to be a combination of a size of the police force and an expected length of sentences, right? This public security policy is going to affect criminal behavior through 4 channels. Some of these are traditional channels in the economics of crime literature. Some are channels that actually we are highlighting, and I think they are kind of a contribution, and that come exactly from the equilibrium dimension that our model allows us to analyze, right? So a public security policy makes individuals afraid of punishment. This is what's called the deterrence effect in the literature. You actually incarcerate some individuals that are incarcerated cannot physically commit crimes. That's what we call incapacitation. individuals that go through prison, they actually lose a little bit of productivity within the model. This increases their future probability of engaging in crime. That's what we call recidivism. And I mean lose productivity, I mean lose productivity in the legal labor market. So this is gonna affect their future probability of committing crimes. That's what we call recidivism. And there is an additional effect that is original to our paper, that is actually by affecting the total number of active criminals, you actually affect the effectiveness of a given public security apparatus, right? So a certain public security apparatus is gonna have its capacity affected by the load of criminals that are active at a given moment in time. And that's what we call the load effect. The social costs of crime in the model are going to include the utility welfare losses from victimization, just from actually being victimized. There are going to be the material losses associated with the destruction of property and costs to engage in crime. There are going to be expenditures in the public security system, and there are going to be the potential losses to criminals from incarceration and including future loss in productivity. And our framework basically allows us to analyze the optimality of a given policy according to any welfare metric that is defined over these 4 dimensions. We're going to be using kind of a utilitarian welfare metric, but you could use anything else. You could possibly also include other political constraints. I'm going to talk about a little bit about it later on. So you could imagine that it's not politically acceptable to increase the budget. So you could actually have a fixed budget as a constraint. You could imagine that it's not politically feasible to allow crime, the optimal crime rate to go up. To allow the crime rate to go up in equilibrium. So you could actually put whatever constraint you think would be reasonable in a given setting, and you could still use our framework to analyze the optimality of different policies under certain constraints and certain welfare metrics. There are important dimensions of crime as an economic phenomenon that we are ignoring for now, and I'm listing what we think are the most relevant ones, right? So risk aversion is not included here. So we do not have utility loss from being exposed to the risk of victimization. We just have utility loss from actual victimization, from being victimized. There is an associated issues that there is no private change in behavior to avoid crime. So there's nothing like private security expenditures in the model, or there's no like change in behavioral habits. There's no avoiding to walk in a dark street at night, right? So here, there's just the only thing that can be done to avoid crime is actually through public security expenditures. There are really no private actions that could affect the probability of victimization. There is no criminal capital, so individuals do not accumulate a criminal capital. They just actually lose a little bit of legal human capital when they're incarcerated. And I mean, something that's very important in light of the current debate worldwide, there is no police bias, there is no wrongful convictions, right? So there's no group that is particularly targeted here, and there is no misbehavior of the police here or of the judicial system more generally. We think all of these are potentially important dimensions. It's really just that we're giving one step in the direction of developing this model, and we are hoping that in the future these different dimensions will be incorporated in extensions as well. Okay, so to give you an idea of what would be the objective of an approach such as this, imagine this policy plane showing the potential combinations of policies that a government could choose. So in the vertical axis, we have here the certainty of punishment, is basically the size of the police force affecting the probability that a criminal is caught. And the horizontal axis, we have the severity of punishment. So how many years or months you're gonna spend in jail in case you're caught. So you could imagine a given policy here. So this would be the 2004 US policy on property crime, for example. Ideally, what we want to do is to be able to map in different curves in this plane, right? So this would be the difference, how the welfare levels associated with the different combinations of severity of punishment and certainty of punishment. And based on that, we could define this shaded area right here, which is basically describing the combinations of policies that would improve upon the 2004 US policy. Among those, we could in principle identify the optimal public security policy from a global perspective. Obviously, this is to some extent heroic exercise. You have to really trust a lot in the assumptions of the model. At the same time, this is what we see as the direction that should be followed within this literature. This should be the final objective of an evaluation of a public security policy. Right? So that's what we're going to be trying to do here. I'm going to be showing you in the end a figure very similar to this that is actually estimated from our model. Okay, so there is a long literature. I think I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to skip this literature. There is classic works going from Beccaria to Becker, a lot of empirical work, reduced form or randomized work in more recent years, and some recent structure work, but we believe that all our model presents substantial differences in relation to all of these and allows us to do this analysis that I'm proposing, that I just proposed in the previous figure, in a way that would not be possible in any of these papers. So I'm going to skip the discussion of the literature. If there are specific questions related to this, I can come back to it later. So I'm going to go over the model, its structure, equilibrium, welfare, and I think probably I'm going to skip the public security technology. I'm going to talk very briefly about the estimation and then try to get to the qualitative results. And Manuel, if you could let me know when I have 10 minutes to go, that would be helpful, just so that I can calibrate my the presentation as I go along.
I will.
Okay, thank you. So the basics of the model. So there is a public safety policy here. As I mentioned to you, this is a combination of the certainty and severity of punishment. Severity of punishment, we're calling severity of punishment the sentence length. I'm putting sentence on quotes here because it's not really sentence, it's the time spent in jail, right? So that's what I'm going to be calling the sentence, the actual time spent in jail. There is the certainty of punishment that is associated with the probability of detection, right? And we're going to be presenting, the paper develops a micro-founded model of the probability of detection as a function of police expenditures. I'm going to mention that very, very briefly, but it is also one of the contributions of what we are doing. Individuals in this model, the agents, are going to be heterogeneous in productivity. They're going to have a life cycle wage profile, and crime is going to be a rational decision. But there's going to be a mass of individuals that considers committing crimes, and a mass of individuals that is completely honest and will never commit crimes, right? So we're going to have two types of individuals. We call some of them honest and some of them dishonest, right? So the honest individuals are individuals that are not going to be even contemplating committing a crime under any circumstances. And then the other individuals that are the dishonest ones are individuals that, depending on the circumstances, they might actually decide to commit a crime, right? And these are going to be just kind of randomly distributed in the population. Individuals are going to be facing an age-specific cost of committing crime. The goal of this is actually to match the life cycle profile of criminal involvement. There is a very marked life cycle profile. The effects of incarceration in the model are going to be scarring and incapacitation. So each year of incarceration is going to reduce your productivity in the legal labor market. That's what I'm calling scarring. And incapacitation is basically the idea that individuals who are locked up, they just cannot physically commit crimes. And obviously here, going back to Becker's original contribution, the objective of the social planner is to maximize welfare, not necessarily to minimize crime. So the model is built as a discrete time model. There's a linear utility on income. Agents are characterized by a certain age, a propensity to commit crimes. These are the two types that I mentioned to you before, and the productivity level. So that's basically their wage in the legal labor market. Crime is going to be an interaction between a dishonest and an honest agent. So these are going to be random encounters. And the definition of a crime is going to be a financial transfer from victim to criminal. This financial transfer is going to be accompanied by some damage to the victim. So this is the material, psychological cost of being victim of a crime. Somebody pulls a gun on you and this actually traumatizes you or something like that. And the cost paid by the criminal depending on the age, right? So in some sense, there is, to commit a crime, the criminal has to pay some cost, right? So this is not the risk of being caught or anything like that. It's just like, you could think about it as either the physical or psychological cost of actually engaging in a crime. If it's a very sophisticated crime, the individual actually has to spend resources to come up with the crime itself. But you could also think about just the psychological cost of pulling a gun on somebody, right? Or something along those lines. The aggregate crime rate is going to be given by V, and crimes are going to be detected with the probability P of V. That's going to be a function of how much you spend on police and so on and so forth, right? But we're going to take PV as given for now, and I may come back to this briefly later on. So each individual sentence is going to be a random variable with geometric distribution and the expected value lambda. So lambda is the average length of sentences. An agent is going to choose in each period whether to commit crimes or not. If the individual decides to commit crimes, it's going to actually engage on a random number of crimes per period. This is just the idea of capturing the criminal opportunities are kind of a random event. The individual decides to be a criminal for a given, he wakes up a given day, he says, oh, I'm going to commit some crimes today. And he's waiting for criminal opportunities, right? And these criminal opportunities are somewhat random, right? So they're going to have an exponential distribution within a given period. The combination of these processes, I mean, intuitively is very clear. There are some technicalities, but intuitively, the combination of these processes is going to determine P bar, which is the probability of incarceration per period that is conditional on the decision to commit crimes, right? So obviously, this is going to be the probability that I'm caught in a given period is a function of the probability that I'm caught when committing one given crime, right? And this is going to be a combination of this probability PV with the number of random opportunities that I had during that period, right? If I commit a crime, I have an instantaneous net gain that's given by pi bar t. So that's basically how much I'm going to gain from committing that crime. I mean, just the instantaneous gain is not included the potential probability of being caught and the cost of going to jail. It's just the benefit involved in the transaction of the crime itself, right? The instantaneous benefit from crime. And this is going to depend on the amount that is stolen, that is going to be taken as given here, and also on the cost of committing this crime. So there are going to be three situations, I mean, three decisions possible here, and two states, right, in this universe. I can be in prison or I can be free. When I'm free, I can decide whether to engage in crime, that's the E, or not to engage in crime, that's the E tilde. If I decide not to engage in crime, I'm going to be free next period. There are no wrongful convictions here, so if I don't commit any crimes, I'm free next period. If I decide to commit a crime, I may remain free with probability 1 minus P bar, or I may be sent to jail with probability P bar. If I'm in jail, I can be set free with a probability 1 over lambda plus 1. or I can actually remain in jail with probability lambda over lambda plus 1. And remember that lambda is the expected length of sentences. We focus on a stationary state. That's basically when aggregate quantities are constant. Let me just explain very briefly to you the choices faced by individuals and the different alternatives. So the instantaneous utility, just the instantaneous utility from being honest when I'm free is the wage that I'm gonna get. That's WT when my age is T. And F is just a lump sum tax that everybody pays, right? So I'm gonna be getting WT, I'm gonna be paying the lump sum F. If I actually commit a crime, I'm gonna be getting WT, I'm going to be paying the lump sum tax F, and I'm going to be getting the extra gain from crime that is actually pi bar, right? Big pi bar. If I'm in jail, there's going to be a B, which is the consumption equivalent of the welfare of being in jail, and we're just saying that you're paying the cost F as well. But I mean, everything that matters here, the difference between these two, right? This is just a normalization. There is some welfare level when you're in jail that is basically constant. There is a life cycle productivity. So over your life, your wage rises. It rises according to gamma T. This is going to be basically capturing the typical life cycle profile of wages. If you go to jail, there is a utility loss. I'm sorry. There is a productivity loss with every year spent in jail. This productivity loss is basically theta. So theta is going to be smaller than 1, and gamma typically is going to be larger than 1. Eventually, it's going to get closer to 1. And again, this is going to be capturing the life cycle. Gamma is going to be capturing the life cycle profile of wages. Theta is going to be capturing the productivity cost of being incarcerated, right? The loss in legal productivity. With the previous transitions, these different instantaneous utilities and these dynamics here are going to determine the value functions. Let me just go over one of them, which is really just the most important one. So the value function of being free is basically the wage that I earn today, and then I'm going to choose between committing a crime and not committing a crime, right? If I do not commit a crime, I just have, in addition to my wage and the taxes that I pay, the continuation value. I'm going to be free again next period with a higher wage that is gamma T times W, and life goes on. If I decide to commit a crime, I'm going to get, in addition to the wage that I get and the lump sum tax that I pay, I'm going to get the extra money from committing crime. But then I'm going to have a probability P bar of being caught and going to jail, in which case the value function here is a value function of being in prison next period with a wage that would be gamma T times W next period. If I am not caught, I'm not caught with probability 1 minus P bar, in which case I'm free next period and I start again next period with V of gamma W. So obviously the key decision here is whether to commit crime or not, and this is going to depend on the value of these two alternatives here. The value function for an individual that is in prison is basically mechanic. He gets the flow of utility, then there's a probability that he remains in prison next period. So he would continue with the VP, and then there is a probability that he is released next period, and in which case he will become a free individual with a slightly lower wage because there is a penalty of being in prison. That's a theta W. So let me speed up a little bit here, but this is a key feature of the model. So I'm going to spend 2 minutes here at least. So the expected gain from crime, instantaneous gains from crime are actually summarized by the P bar that I told you, the pi bar that I told you about before. These are basically given, and these are independent of wages, these are independent of our productivity in the labor market. So we're talking about common crime. So we're not talking about white collar crime where you think that maybe more skilled people, more educated people might have a comparative advantage. We're going to be talking about the common economic crimes, and we're assuming that the benefits from these crimes are not going to be related to your labor market productivity, right? The expected loss from crime in turn is going to be related to the labor market productivity. So with probability 1 minus p bar, you are not caught when you're committing crimes, and you're going to be free next period, and everything is fine. With probability p bar, you're going to be caught when you're committing crimes, and then your loss by being incarcerated is basically the difference in welfare from being free and from being in prison. That's basically delta t. This delta t is actually increasing on your labor market wages, right, on your legal market wages, because the higher your legal wages, the higher the opportunity cost of being in prison. So what happens in a model such as this is that for each age, there is going to be a cutoff productivity below which individuals who are dishonest, so honest individuals are never going to be contemplating crimes, but individuals who are dishonest below a certain wage are going to be actually considering committing crimes, are going to decide to commit crimes, actually, right, to be more precise. So there's always going to be a W star T that is going to be actually defining the productivity level at age T below which individuals are going to, dishonest individuals are going to decide to engage in criminal actions, right? And this actually is what allows us, we can do a backward induction and bring this decision back to age 0. And that's basically what allows us to characterize the decisions of individuals to engage in crime or not, taking as given the probability of apprehension and the other aggregate variables in the aggregate crime rate and all the aggregate variables in this economy, right? So here we're going to have a rational expectations equilibrium, meaning that we're going to have individual decisions that are going to describe, like the one that I just tried to characterize, that are going to be describing individual behavior for an aggregate crime rate V star and a given set of expenditures in public security policy. The rational expectations equilibrium is basically the aggregate crime rate V star that is actually consistent with these individual decisions, and that's basically what we look at in this model. Welfare, I'm gonna go very quickly here. So basically, the government's going to be choosing expenditures on police protection, that is K. The government's going to be choosing an average length of sentences, that is lambda, and it's going to be choosing a lump sum tax to finance the public security policy, that's F, basically. And we are assuming that the government always runs a budget, a balanced budget, right? So the government's spending whatever it actually raises every period. The welfare loss from crime that we are actually considering is going to be basically adding up everything that is associated with the criminal event. So these are the direct losses from the criminal event itself. These are the expenditures in the public security system, prison expenditures and police expenditures. They are waste from the perspective of production, overall production, and the criminal losses as well. So freedom deprivation and human capital depreciation of the criminals. This is actually very close to what the accounting methodology in the cost of crime typically estimates, right? I mean, but the point that we're making here is that actually what is relevant is not this number on its own, by itself, right? What is relevant is how this number, this aggregate welfare loss responds to marginal changes in policy, right? And that's really the focus of this paper. So one contribution of the paper is actually to come up with this probability of apprehension that is basically a function of police expenditures, the probability of catching a crime, right? So what I'm calling the probability of apprehension is the probability of catching a crime. So this is basically a function of police expenditures and not the number of the aggregate crime rate, right? Of the number of crimes being committed. So this traditionally in the literature, this is basically an arbitrary function. One of the contributions of our paper is that actually we realize, I mean, we kind of realize, it is obvious we do not realize, we recognize within the theoretical framework that this is not really simply a technology, right? It's actually a result of the interaction between police and criminals, and we model explicitly this interaction as a game that takes place between police and criminals each period, right? So conditional expenditures on police force, condition on the decisions of individuals to engage in crime. There is a game being played between police and criminals, and this game actually leads endogenous to a function describing the probability that a crime is caught as a function of police expenditures and the number of aggregate crimes being committed, right? So we call this the police and thieves game. And within the framework of the model, you can think about it as the game the police and criminals are playing within each period, given the conditions, given the decisions to engage in crime, and given the decisions on how much to spend in the public security apparatus, right? I think this is an interesting part of the framework. My co-author Eduardo has a paper that actually derives a similar function under much more general conditions, but I'm not going to have time to go over this in much more detail. But the fact that the function is macro-founded and it has all the desirable properties. So like when expenditures in police go to 0, the probability of catching a crime goes to 0. When expenditures in police go to infinity, the probability of catching a crime goes to 1, and other features such as this. So let me mention very briefly what we do in terms of estimation, and then we move on to the more substantive discussion of the quantitative results. That is really the most interesting part, right? So we focus on property crime in the US. So it's basically common crime, the robbery, larceny, burglary, and auto theft. The benchmarks the US in 2004. That's basically because there was a, let's say, roughly constant prison population then. So you could argue that it looks a little more like a stationary state. We have data from different sources, and National Crime Victimization Survey, National Crime Report, CPS, and lots of data from the criminal justice system, and then LSY as well. And we use a lot of data, a lot of estimates that were generated by empirical micro studies. I think that's a nice feature because we actually able to bring the theory much closer to the empirical work within economics of crime. And I do like that part of the paper, so I'm going to mention how we use some of the estimates from the literature. So some functional forms and some parameters that we take from the literature that I haven't mentioned up to now. So the cost of committing a crime that
you have 10
sorry
minutes. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. So the cost of committing a crime is going to be quadratic on age. So these are going to be the parameters is A, B, and C. Individuals here, just to simplify our life, individuals are going to retire at age 65, and then they're going to earn a one-shot alpha W. That's basically because there's virtually no criminal, no property crimes being committed by people above 60. So we just end up the model there, right? So at age 65, people get an alpha W that's a multiple of their last wage, let's say. We have an earnings profile that is basically calibrated from the CPS in terms of the life cycle and from the NLSY. Right now, we're going to move everything to the CPS in the next version. We're working on that right now. There's not really a justification for using the NLSY, but we are basically estimating a life cycle profile of wages and feeding a dispersion of wages based on data from household surveys, right? There is a bunch of variables that, sorry, my phone, my phone rang and it actually rang on my headphones. Sorry about that. So we're taking a bunch of parameters from the literature, from the literature on economics of crime, or from statistics of the legal system. Just a couple of things that are actually particularly important here. So the depreciation of human capital by spending time in prison is basically 13%. That comes from a paper by Jeff Grogger from 95. So if you spend 1 year in jail, you're going to have your earnings reduced by 13%. I mean, the potential, the opportunity cost is even larger than that, where your earnings should have gone up, right? And actually, they're going to go down by 13%. There are the average transfer per crime, the average damage per crime from Cohen, and some other data on cost of per prison and police expenditures. We estimate 9 parameters. These are actually parameters related to the cost of committing a crime by age. This is the multiplier on the net present value of wages at 65, the little alpha, average number of crime opportunities per year, the wage equivalent of being in prison, the number of individuals who are willing to commit a crime by cohort, right? And the parameters of the public security technology, the little p, right? The model is estimated, everything is estimated simultaneously, but just to give you a flavor of where the variation is coming from in each case, in terms of this, of the parameters related to the age profile of the cost of committing a crime or the alpha at age 65, we have the age distribution of the inflow of prisoners in the US. This gives us 15 moments. In terms of the criminal opportunities per year, we have the number of property crimes that are committed per year. Abrams and Rolfs, they estimate the value of 90 days of freedom. In some sense, this informs the estimation of the utility value of being in prison. The NLSY provides some estimate of the percentage of individuals between 18 and 23 that actually have committed crimes. This allows us to estimate the number of dishonest individuals in a given cohort. We have the parameters of the public security technology that are going to be closely related to the police and incarceration elasticities that have been estimated in microeconometric studies of in the economics of crime, like Levitt's papers on the effect of police and incarceration. And we also have data on police, on prison population. That's going to be also informing some of these. We estimate the model with using these moments, using GMM and assuming a diagonal variance covariance matrix. These are actually the estimated parameters. Most of them are actually reasonably precise. Some of them are not that precisely estimated, but actually the counterfactuals that I'm going to show you, they're pretty good in terms of precision. So rather than actually going over what each of these parameters mean, given the limitation in terms of time, let me just skip this and go to the quantitative exercises. Let me just mention to you. So this is basically the targeted moments and how we are able to match the targeted moments. And that there's a decent match. I won't say it's actually perfect, but it's not bad at all. We are actually able to match also some untargeted moments with a decent precision as well. So I think the model does a decent job in terms of describing the inflows of prisoners, numbers of crime, and things like that, right? So let me move then to the main results, which are basically related to, we estimate the model. We have the parameters that I showed very briefly to you before. With the estimated model, we are actually able to do whatever counterfactual policy evaluation we want. So among these, we can actually find the optimal public security policy in this setting, right? And the optimal security policy within the estimated model leads to an improvement of 3%, that is roughly close to $2 billion in relation to the 2004 policy that was observed in the US. It actually is associated with a reduction, with a major reduction on the expenditures in police. That leads also, so this is basically a percentage of the benchmark. So the optimal policy in our model has actually 23% less expenditures in the police force, a little more time spent in prison, so average time spent in prison increasing by 22%. Overall, this would lead to a reduction in expenditures of 13%, in terms of public security policy, and actually to an increase of 10% in the crime rate. So we, in some sense, our model, as sterilized as it is, actually supports the idea that indeed they should defund a little bit the police, right? There is too much police and actually too little crime at the margin, right? So again, talking about property crimes, a little bit, the optimal policy would imply a little bit of an increase in crime in the U.S. One thing that may be a little surprising here is that the optimal policy would imply an increase of the time spent in prison, but actually we would be reducing the probability of imprisoning somebody, of incarcerating somebody, right? So despite the increase in the average time spent in prison, that also would be associated with a small increase in prison population. Actually, it would reduce the probability that individuals would go through prison at some point in their lifetime. So in some sense, you would be catching on average more dangerous criminals and leaving them a little longer in jail, right? And might increase overall prison population a little bit. The flow of people going into prison in the model would fall by 8.5% in comparison to the 2004 policy. And another thing to remember is that we are focusing only on property crime. And so if you think about like the major increase in U.S. prison population in recent decades, that was mostly associated with drug-related crimes, right? So it's not really, we are not actually, the prediction is not to increase overall prison population on top of what you're observing today, but we're talking about a fraction of the overall prison population in the U.S., right? So it's, and definitely not talk about drug-related crimes. So that's very important to highlight. All the gains are actually coming from the reduction in expenditures in police. In other dimensions, actually, there are increasing loss, but the expenditures in police are so large here that actually it's worth it. If we look at in that plane that I suggested to you before, so that's the policy plane. Lambda is the time of incarceration. K is the police expenditures. What we have here, this point here is the 2004 policy, and this point right here is our optimal public security policy. We, as I mentioned to you, I mean, the counterfactor is quite precisely estimated. These ellipses that I'm showing you here, they are basically the confidence interval around our optimal policy. So the optimal policy is significantly different from the 2004 policy, leading to a lower expenditure in police, but actually increasing the time of incarceration. Just to highlight how relevant it is to look at these simultaneously, to look at these policies at the same time and the equilibrium effects, we can try to look within the model at what typically is done in empirical studies. That's basically, so this figure right here is basically looking at how welfare would change when we change police expenditures, keeping the sentence length constant. So if we keep the other dimension of the policy constant, optimality would be achieved here by reducing police expenditures, right? The same thing is true if we actually keep police expenditures constant and think about what we should do to the length of sentences. So if we look at like this partial derivatives, keeping another dimension constant, so also in terms of sentence lengths, given the current level, given the 2004 level of police expenditures, it would be actually optimal to reduce sentence lengths. So these are partial analyses that do not consider interaction, the optimality of the interaction across policies. So in some sense, these are actually comparable to what is done in empirical micro studies looking at partial effects. So even though in the aggregate, when you take into account equilibrium effects, the optimal thing to do is to reduce police expenditures and increase average sentence lengths. If we look at these two policies in isolation, taking the other one as given, at the 2004 levels, the optimal thing to do would be actually to reduce both. So this actually highlights the relevance of the equilibrium analysis. And I know I have already run out of time, so the only thing I want to mention is that that figure that I showed to you in the beginning, we actually calculate that figure within the estimated model. That leads to exactly the type of analysis that I mentioned before, where we have the 2004 expenditures and the optimal expenditures, and these are mapped into this policy indifference curves right here that would allow for any type of analysis. And one thing that is actually very interesting that arises out of this, and that, I mean, by no means this is imposed by the model structure, is that we estimate that the 2004 policy is very close to a policy that would be minimizing crime conditional on a level of expenditures. So the blue curve here is basically an ISO cost, while the pink area here is basically the area that can be achieved with a crime reduction. So this is not precisely the minimization of crimes subject to the 2004 public security expenditures, but it's actually very, very, very close to that. So also in some sense, we're showing that it doesn't seem that the system is entirely irrational, but it actually also doesn't seem that it would be maximizing welfare. It's actually going for another goal that would be minimization of crime subject to a given constraint. Again, this is not imposed at all by the model. I went over time already, so I'm going to stop here to leave at least a little bit of time for question. I'm sorry for I had too many things to show. So let me just stop here.
Okay, thanks, Rodrigo. It was great. We are opening up for questions. Again, you can ask questions. You can either raise your hand, or you can use the chat facility or the Q&A facility in Zoom. Before we get some questions, oh, there is one here. Does it mean the crime is habitual?
In the model, so let me just share the screen again. In the model, there would be some, I mean, we don't have any behavioral dimensions in the model. I think behavioral dimensions are important in certain crime, certain types of crime. In our model, there's gonna be some persistency in crime. First, because actually it's related to individual characteristics that are also going to be persistent over time, but actually also because we have this effect from incarceration, that incarceration actually reduces your wages in the legal market. So this is going to generate some recidivism that's going to be basically some persistence in crime. So it would seem like habitual crime, but we do not have any behavioral dimension built into the model, but there would be some persistence in crime inside the model.
And just along the same lines, Rodrigo, given the size of the population in prisons and all sorts of information flowing around, is there any way that the individual can actually update their priors with respect to either becoming a criminal or not?
Oh, I think that there is an issue of how these expectations are formed, right? And how individuals get to know about the changes in policy, right? So I think this is definitely not instantaneous, and I think it's definitely not a perfect rational expectations setting as we're doing here. So in some sense, what I would say that this is really for analytical convenience, right? So I think in reality, this is probably information that flows through these networks and through what the individual can see in his daily life, right? So I think to some extent, this probably in reality flows a lot through peer groups, right? So individuals know people who are going to be involved in crime. They know more or less that these trajectories, and it is based a little bit on this updating. But I agree that there is an important dimension that's formation of expectations that we are really abstracting from that, just taking. I think I would the way I would put it is that this kind of a rational expectations equilibrium that we are looking at would be kind of a reasonable approximation in the very long run, right? I mean, if there is a major change in public security policies and years go by and people actually get used to it and people understand more or less what's going on. So I think that's how I would put it. Definitely, it wouldn't be something that would be reasonable within months or something like that.
And I was also thinking, because it's about crime and punishment, but maybe I missed that dimension. But is there anything on the judiciary in the model, or which should be in there? For instance, how good or bad the judiciary is in actually sentencing people?
So yeah, I mean, again, we don't have that. So this is, in our case, I think this is all kind of collapsed into the probability P, right? So the probability P is the probability that you're caught. And if you're caught, you're really sentenced, right? So maybe one way to answer your question would be that actually P is a compound of police. P in the end is really a compound of the police and the judicial system, right? So if you might have a very effective police, but actually a very inefficient judicial system that actually lets everybody go free anyway, right? So this would actually mean that P should be actually capturing as well the probability that you end up being sentenced and sent to jail. So I think that's the way the model is actually framed. That's the way I would interpret the model. At the same time, there are issues related to mistrials and things like that are completely absent from the model, as I mentioned before. So if there is bias in the judicial system, and we know that there is, I mean, there's a lot of evidence on that, this is not incorporated into the model. I think we could incorporate that if nothing stops the model from actually being extended to say, even if you're an honest individual, there is a probability that you're sent to jail, right? I mean, we could actually have something like that in the model. And I don't think it would be analytically very complicated. I think in terms of estimation, it would become a major challenge because you don't have much information on those. So I think these are important dimensions that I think we chose in this first step in this direction to neglect, but I think they're important dimensions.
And also because we all live in sort of violent societies, and down here in South Africa we have also private security companies which actually patrol the cities. I don't remember if we, at least in my hometown in Brazil, I don't recall having that sort of stuff. But I'm not sure about São Paulo or back in the States. But how would that, and essentially those private companies, they are doing somehow the job of the police, and the police is kind of, we keep spending on the police, but we also have the private security companies. How would that, if at all, affect, or would that be something that can be also incorporated into the model or in some sort of parameter of the model?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. That's actually one of the things that bother me the most about this model, right? Because I think it's I mean, in São Paulo, there is, I mean, if you go to the very wealthy neighborhoods, there are going to be some private security, mostly unarmed. I mean, I think typically unarmed and so on, but just kind of patrolling certain streets, right? So, but actually, it's much broader than that, right? Because I think the public security expenditures are the most kind of visible dimension, but really. I think any change in behavior that has as an objective a reduction in crime has the same feature, right? So if in a nice city, I think that's the case in Rio, for instance, I may imagine that in certain places in South Africa as well. In Rio, that's a very, very nice urban beaches. People don't go after a certain time because they're going to be afraid of being victimized, of being robbed, right? That's a change in behavior to avoid victimization. That is, in a very abstract theoretical sense, it's actually equivalent to spending on private security. You're engaging in a cost in a costly individual behavior to reduce your probability of victimization. In terms of consumption patterns, I do believe that that's a very important thing, right? The welfare loss of not being able to go to Leblon in Rio and just hang around at 9 p.m. when it's hot and you wanted to do that, just lie down on the beach. That's a major welfare loss, right? I mean, if you combine all of the things that we do not do because of that. And the model doesn't have that at all, right? We thought a little bit about doing that, I think. Again, I mean, I think it's something that theoretically wouldn't be, it's not very difficult. We thought about some ways of incorporating that. The problem becomes that actually information on this dimension of welfare losses from crime is very, very limited. So when we moved to estimate the model, when we moved in the direction to estimate the model, we really wouldn't have much information on that, right? And it would be a little bit of a guesswork. So that's something that we did spend a fair amount of time thinking about. And I want to say that at some point we're going to be able to incorporate that, because I think that's really a major issue. To be entirely honest, I'm not sure.
Okay. And another thing that comes to mind is the technology, right? In terms of deterrence. Again, we live in kind of violent societies for all sorts of reasons. And here in SA, we have all sorts of technologies, walls and higher walls and electric fences and alarms inside, outside. The private companies, now they want to close the whole neighborhoods. That sort of deterrence technology, does it matter at all? What's your hunch?
I think it's, I mean, one dimension of that is related to our previous discussion, is private expenditures and how they're going to be reducing the probability of victimization. So this dimension, I think it's very closely, I mean, it is basically what we were discussing before. Another thing that comes in this discussion that I think in the direction of what you're suggesting is that there is a further complication that the model, the way it's framed right now, I don't think it would be able to capture, because there is an issue of externality in crime. So I think, I mean, certain technologies for private protection, they can be very effective at the individual level, but sometimes they're not really that effective at the aggregate level. So sometimes you're just actually switching crime from location A to location B when somebody is taken on a private on some measure of private protection, and because these decisions are taken in a decentralized way, typically they're not going to be efficient, right? So this is a more an issue of the distribution of crime rates across different people and locations, and how private expenditures actually can lead to inefficient outcomes. The way the model is framed right now, we cannot address the second issue. So this would be a little more complicated. But there is an issue of whether these private security measures, whether they generate a lot of inefficiency in the sense of actually forcing everybody to adopt private security measures, when maybe actually some aggregate measure with a much lower cost would be much more effective, right? So, but it's closely related to the previous discussion. It just brings the dimension of the dimension of inefficiency and this decentralized solution to the discussion, right?
Absolutely. Okay, thanks, folks. Any other question or comment or suggestion to Rodrigo? 1, 2, 3. Okay, Rodrigo, thanks again for availing yourself to coming here and talking to us. Very much appreciated. Let me also give thanks to all the participants. I know there were issues with Zoom today, so I thank you for being here. And also thanks to ERSA for facilitating this webinar series. Rodrigo, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuel, for the invitation. My pleasure.
Thank you. I'll stop recording now, and thank you. I'm closing the meeting. Thank you. Bye.